Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Monday, June 22nd, 2026, and today, the other melons. Also, which crops make the most sense for covered growing space? We'll do all that, so let's do it. All right, happy Monday, everyone. I hope you all had lovely weekends, dads and those who play that role, obviously. I hope you all had lovely Father's Days. They were definitely long because Sunday was also the solstice, so happy solstice as well. That's it. We have passed the longest day of the year, and it's all downhill from here, sunlight-wise. Of course, I busted my butt last week to try and stay caught up so that I could justify some World Cup action, and that's worked fairly well, honestly, so far. I mean, the U.S. got a pretty nice win there and clinched the group, so that's very exciting. Good job, lads. I, meanwhile, got the tomatoes trellised on Friday, got some seeds started, some beds prepped, and this week it's getting a bunch of lettuce in the ground, getting some trellises set up in the field, all the things, everything is happening all at once. Soon the potatoes and onions will have to come out too. So we are in the midst of the madness. It's summer, so it's busy. No surprises there. The rain we've been getting, though, that's a little bit surprising. Another flood watch today. That's what? 3 this month? Why can't rain just be normal here? How are things looking on your farms? Let us know. Or, better yet, upload a 20-second farm video clip to Dropbox or Drive and share that with Farmer Mike at no-tillgrowers.com. Always a highlight to see those. All right, so as I said, it is Monday, where every week this year we are digging into a single, less talked about crop in a series we're calling Planting and Raving. Today, the crop we're going to cover is melons. I know, I just did watermelons a couple weeks ago, and although sure, there are, a lot of similarities between melons and watermelons in terms of production, there are also some subtle nuances, like, for instance, melons can be more easily grown under trellis. Whether or not you should is a different question, but that's possible, so take that. Watermelons. Also, they have different things to look for when you are ready to harvest them. Anyway, we will do all the normal stuff that we do here on Mondays and break down varieties, etc. in the first segment, and then get to planting, harvesting, storing in the second half. Now, to start, what do I mean when I differentiate melons from watermelons? Well, although, okay, sure, I sometimes just call watermelons melons. In general, when I refer to melons, I'm referring to your cantaloupe and honeydew style melons, less cucumbery and more creamy melony. So, okay, let's start there because varieties will matter quite a bit here, especially as we creep later into the season, though I should say that late melons are an underrated treat. A CSA, for instance, would be delighted with September melons. Anyway, there are two main types of melons, or true melons as they are sometimes referred, smooth and netted. The netted varieties are things like Gallia and cantaloupe, but also the slightly more difficult French Chanterelle melons. Be careful when shopping for these if you plan to sell them, because especially with something like the Chanterelle melons, albeit delicious, are a bit more difficult to grow and bruise quite easily. They are a specialty melon for a reason. They are not as easy to grow while also being super delicious. There are netted varieties with green flesh, orange flesh, pale and deep. So not all netted melons are the same, and not all smooth melons are the same. The smooth melons, however, are things like the classic honeydew melon. I grew up eating cantaloupe and honeydew, and even saying the words is hyper evocative for me for how tasty these things can be. Anyway, there are some different shapes in both categories, but in particular with the smooth skin melons, you get everything from like sort of squat and round to oblong, like the Crenshaw or Asian melons. Flavors can range from rich and sweet and floral to more nuanced and slightly more savory. A big determining factor for you, however, should be your market if you plan to sell them versus like balling and freezing them, as we have done many of years with our excess melons. So what might your market or family actually want to eat? Also, disease resistance is important. You may not know what diseases are prevalent in your area for melons, but powdery mildews tend to be common in, say, like drier areas, whereas downy mildew tends to be more common in wetter areas. Papaya ring virus, if it's not obvious in the name, tends to be a more common tropical disease. I bring that up because you can sometimes shop for melons by the disease resistance. So if there is a disease you've had issues with in the past, that can help you narrow down the variety selection a little bit. Then, of course, good soil and fertility management will lend a big hand. Of course, like all watermelons, regular melons are not as profitable as most crops, but generally more profitable than watermelons because you simply get more units per square foot. Similarly, though, melons tend to be 70 to 80 days maturity, similar to watermelons, with 4 to 7-ish melons per vine, depending on the variety and production. In the third segment, we will discuss the production, but some people do go as far as to trellis these things, and Well, unless you add that labor into the cost, it's going to be hard to justify doing the trellising. It's just a lot of work. It's infrastructure. It's stuff you have to put up and take down. And then also the melons have to be supported individually on a trellis just so they don't break the vine. Now, if you can sell them at a really good price, or you're just growing them for yourselves and love a good challenge and you are in limited growing space, then sure, go for it. Trellis away. But in general, you're just growing melons on the ground to try to minimize labor. Moreover, like I said, some of these melons are going to need individual support, so the technique is going to be really important there. Shout out your favorite varieties in the comment section, and we're going to take a quick break before returning to production in segment 3. So up next, what does and doesn't make sense to grow in a tunnel? We ask a mole, right? Just go to the experts. BRB.
Today's episode is brought to you by Grown By. Grow smarter with Grown By, the farmer-owned cooperative. Grown By is the platform for online sales of everything, custom and traditional CSAs, halves of beef, flower bouquets, wholesale to restaurants, and now Grown By supports in-person sales too. Their new app, Grown By Register, you can supercharge your market and farm stand, finally bringing together your online and offline sales and customer data. Grown By is proud to make local food accessible by processing SNAP benefits online and in person right within the app. Grown By helps you put your best food forward. Schedule a demo at coop.grownby.com/no-till. That's coop.grownby.com/no-till. All right, back to the show.
A quick and loving reminder that if you, the listener or viewer, are enjoying this podcast, getting even a small amount of value from it, consider supporting our work over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I will try to get to questions from everywhere that questions come in, but I will always get to your Patreon questions. Now, today's Patreon question comes to us from Patreon member Austin at Vital Root Farm, who writes, quote, "Hey Jesse, hoping you can break down how you think about what is best grown in a hoop house / unheated cover and what is best grown in the field. I run a small CSA and therefore need to grow a wide variety of crop types. I often struggle to pick which crops should be grown in my limited tunnel space versus in the field. Some crops are a no-brainer to grow in the tunnel in my zone 3A climate. For example, eggplants and peppers, but I'm wondering if there are other crops you lean towards growing in a tunnel and others you lean towards growing in a field setting, especially when tunnel space is more limited. How do you think about these decisions? Thanks," end quote. All right, this is a great question, and to be honest, there are several different ways to think about this, but I'll do my best based on my experience and what I know of most growers' approach to unheated tunnel production. First, it's important to start thinking about what the value of a tunnel is to you based on the type of farm you're talking about here, which it sounds like Austin's obviously doing like a CSA and thinking about these things. So if, for instance, on a market farm where you are taking the produce to the farmer's market, the biggest advantage of a high tunnel or hoop house, which from here on out will be the stand-in term for unheated growing space, is extending the season earlier and then also extending the season later. If you're going to the farmer's market, in other words, there is a huge financial incentive to be the first grower to market with, for instance, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, etc. And then a huge financial incentive to keep those same crops growing into the fall when everyone else who just grows in the field is done. That said, tunnel production doesn't just speed up production, but it also increases marketability, meaning stuff just looks better coming out of the tunnel. That's tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, but also lettuce, beets, arugula, and so on. So although there is some advantage to getting earlier crops for a CSA and prettier looking crops, the incentives aren't quite the same because you can't necessarily charge more for early tomatoes like a farmer's market farmer might when they have a monopoly for the tomato market for a couple weeks before everybody else comes with their tomatoes. So for a CSA, the incentives might be more about getting hot crops in a cold climate like Austin is here, or getting high density crops that you can get a lot of like arugula, lettuce, radishes, etc. in a small amount of space so that you can simply get a wider diversity of crops while also using the field space for slower growing stuff. Context definitely matters, but also any farm can benefit from an intensity of production. So for instance, you can pump a lot more tomatoes out of a tunnel than you can out of a field for a longer period of time, generally speaking. At least here in Kentucky, tunnel tomatoes do better because the morning dew that we get here, and sometimes just like the endless rain, often leads to foliar diseases in the field eventually, whereas in the tunnel, tomatoes can produce from now until a freeze. Okay, so what tunnel production looks like on my farm is pretty simple. Usually, though, this year I did some experimenting. But anyway, in general, I grow lettuce and kale over the winter, cherry tomatoes, basil, and cucumbers all summer. I rotate as best I can and use the unused space for carrots, beets, lettuce, and often arugula. And that's kind of it. Now, I have tried a million different things in the tunnels from ginger. And obviously, this year I did some broccoli with some Lacey Facilia. It worked out pretty well. But that just goes for most things. Most things grow well in a tunnel. But the trellis opportunity, right, because there is a big big metal frame right above you, thus easy to hang stuff. Make things like tomatoes, cukes, and anything you need to trellis a no-brainer, while the warmth really extends the lettuce and kale seasons. The diffuse light from the plastic, my gosh, do beets and arugula really love that stuff. I find that really makes the difference. The sky is the limit, really, and that doesn't even get into the potential for cut flowers, for perennial production, for ginger, for turmeric, and other crops that don't love cold climates. Like if and when I retire, a topic that we talked about last week, having some fig trees, perhaps with some eucalyptus, just chilling in the tunnel is rather enticing. Cut flowers do really well in tunnels, and tunnels can help you get your Mother's Day crop, which is the biggest day here for cut flower growers, to be quite robust if utilized well. So in general, your market and climate should dictate much of what makes sense in the tunnel for you. If you don't have a market but do have a high tunnel, then perhaps the tunnel is reserved for crops you want the most out of. Slow crops like potatoes, sweet corn, and so on. Those are crops that are going to largely waste your tunnel space because it's not really going to benefit you too much, though a case could be made for really early new potatoes. Those, in general, should go in the field. So I would suggest focusing those slower crops on the fields. The faster crops are the crops that are more intensive that you want to push the season with. Focus those on the tunnel and really use that space as well as you can. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. Let us know what you all would say and or do, listeners and viewers. Otherwise, we're going to take a quick break. And then I was going to tell you a story about what would happen if you crossed a childhood dog with a plant, but I didn't want things to get too melancholy. So we'll just be right back. Yep, I did that. All right, so growing cantaloupe, muskmelon, honeydew type melons is not too dissimilar from growing watermelon types. The harvest is where you see the biggest differences, but in general, the planting is still the same. I like to start melons in wind strip trays, same as most cucurbits. If you don't have wind strip trays, just use cells or use soil blocks, but separate them on the tray so that they're not touching, so that those roots don't mingle, and that can cause all sorts of issues. Again, like all cucurbits, you don't want to mess with the roots. So ideally, you grow them out until about a week or two after their first true leaves appear, and then you plant them so the roots don't get too developed. So give yourself about, 3 to 4 week lead time, or obviously you can just sow them directly into the soil if your weed control is really nice. Nothing complicated there, but they do like it warm to germinate and grow. So if things are cool when you decide to plant them, start them in trays. And again, don't mess with the roots. Fertility definitely matters here. Nothing loves compost more than a cucurbit. So make sure the soil is weed-free, not compacted, and rich with compost and preferably some mulch for moisture. If you can mulch around those things, they really like that. And plus, when those melons sit in just raw soil or bare soil, they tend to get rotting spots. So if you can have them resting on some mulch, they like that. Water them in really well at planting, and maintaining proper moisture throughout will be really important. Moisture is just key for a good melon crop, right? Like they're mostly water. This is generally done through drip tape so as to keep the leaves dry, and then you stop watering too heavily as they start to mature. If you've got mulch, like I said, you're definitely in business here. That will really help with the moisture side. Spacing wise, melons need a fair amount of space. So 2 to 3 feet apart in the row, with rows 6 feet apart. That's 60 to 90 centimeters apart in the row, with rows just under 2 meters apart for those of you in metric land. Then growing them is just growing them, just keeping them protected. Though if you are in an area where you struggle with things like, cucurbit pests like cucumber beetles, you can cover them with insect netting until they are flowering, and then the netting has to come off. Pests or no pests for pollination. But once they get mature like that and they start flowering, they should be good to go. Okay, so harvest depends on the type of melon, but many of these types of melons start to change color when they ripen, so that's a helpful trigger. The tendril trick still works, i.e. when the tendril that is next to the stem of that melon begins to dry, it's time to pick it. But there are other indicators as well that are quite reliable. The color, which I just mentioned, but also the smell. A ripe melon smells ripe at the stem. I mean, it's kind of weird to get down on your hands and knees and smell the melon stems, but it works. Many melons, like cantaloupes, will pop off the stem nice and easy when ripe, whereas honeydew and chanterelle generally need to be cut from the stem. That's called a non-slip melon. When that tendril dies and when it changes color, read up on the variety you got, because no two melons are exactly the same in terms of their harvest cues. This also goes for storage. Netted types can generally be stored in like just your average cooler, whereas chanterelle honeydew types are stored in cellar temperatures for best results. Either can do fine for a few days just at room temps, but those temperatures will give you a week or so of storage. Anyway, I think that's the gist on melons. What did I miss? Got any off the beaten path melon recipes for us? I'd be curious to hear that. Otherwise, Melon Monday, it is over for the entire year. In fact, I'm no more melons for me this year. We're getting too late in the season for that anyway. We just passed the solstice, by golly. I mean, it's basically fall in my mind. Don't forget, No Till Growers is a nonprofit 501c3, so donations are tax deductible and greatly appreciated. Please make sure to like and subscribe and or follow wherever you're getting this podcast. That is an easy way to help us out as well. Enormous thank you to all of our show sponsors. And if you'd ever like to sponsor the show, you can reach out to Farmer Michelle at notillgrowers.com. Big thank you to Michelle. Big thank you to the No Till Growers Board of Directors. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music, Mike Hilbert for the production help and editing, and my wife Hannah for absolutely everything in the world. Also, shouts to Epidemic Sound for the background music that you can hear. Pick up a hat or a copy of my book, The Living Soil Handbook, at notillgrowers.com to support this work. Big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/notillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or you sign up in the month of June, you get a shout on the show. So big shout outs today to Evelyn O. Colquire, Dale at Three Bridge Farm, Jess Carr, Sonia Swatzendruber, Adam Stickler, Robert Kilgore, Steel Road Farms, Thomas, Chris Main, Blue Raven, Norsk Guard Farm, Sue Rowland, Thomas Van Wart, Tyler Lloyd, Andrea Fronti, Tossman, Cedric Reed, William Wiley Madrow, Lynn Tompkins, Steve Hurlbut, Mark Hare, Chris, Larry Shepard, DP, Little Row Farms, Hank Zecca, Jill Crosby, Madison, Alberto Diaz, Peter Broad, Jason Ruel, Earth Care Farmer, Jane Murner, Derek Page, Meredith Light of Granite Springs Farm, Jared Kirst at Rivendell Farm, Fiona and Donnie of Firefly Farm. Thank you all so much for all your support. These are our pollinators. You're the best. This week's story, to repay you for your support in a weird way, is about a misunderstanding. You see, our heroine this week, Grace, babysat for this family for the majority of her life. Genuinely, she's 27 and has babysat for them through like numerous kids since she was 13. And then one day she gets a call from the dad who says, "We know it was you who stole the painting. We've called the cops. They will be in contact with you." But that's not actually the story. It turns out it was not Gracie who stole it. Never would she ever do something like that. A neighbor, by pure happenstance, just happened to have video footage of the thief, the eldest child, in fact, and it was a whole big misunderstanding and a whole scandal. Older child had some issues. But anyway, this week's story is not about that. This week's story is about what happened next, and that is for tomorrow, sign-ups pending, of course, on Goodness Grace CS. Yeah, I don't know. That works, I think. All right. Thanks for watching and or listening. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye.
Introducing America's Workforce Academy, built by Meta. Paid training, a job, and a path to America's future. Because the future is for everyone. Learn more at meta.com/America's Workforce Academy.